Okay, Patrick, it's time for your favorite part of the show, This Week in Trading History. What do you got in store for us?
Well, this week we want to go back to the market closures during the start of World War One, and so we're going back to July 31st of 1914, when the New York Stock Exchange closes, and more importantly, did not reopen for 4.5 months until December 12th of 2014. Can you imagine the markets being closed for 4 months? What would me and you do?
No, we'd have nothing to do. The podcast sure would be boring.
The podcast would be really boring. So let's kind of go through a quick history lesson. So very quickly, the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, and obviously there was a whole bunch of failed diplomatic maneuvering between Austria-Hungary, Germany, France, Russia, and Britain. And obviously,
One second. For those millennials in the crowd, Franz Ferdinand is not a band. He was actually a historical figure, just so
right.
you know.
And I think I pronounced the name right this show, right?
I think you did.
Oh, that's awesome. All right, so in the end, what happened was that Russia offered to negotiate rather than demobilize their army, but then Germany declares war on Russia on August 1st. Then Germany then declares war on France on August 3rd, and then when they attack Belgium on August 4th, England declares war on Germany, and then the whole of Europe suddenly is in full-on war. And so the impact on the global markets was immediate because that led to actually a closure of every major European exchange and many of the exchanges outside of Europe, including the New York Stock Exchange. And although no one would have predicted the result at the beginning of July, by the end, the European stock exchanges were making preparations for the inevitable war and its impact. But never before have all of Europe's major exchanges all simultaneously closed, and never such a global cataclysm struck the world. Right, there was market closures in the past during the 1848 revolution in France, or the panic in 1873 in New York, but there's never been such a global shutdown of stock markets. And what was the irony of this was what caused this was the openness of the global financial markets before the war, right? And so actually at the beginning of 1914, capital was actually quite free-flowing from one country to another without very much hindrance. And so all of these major countries of the world were on a gold standard, and the differences in the exchange rates were arbitraged through the buying and selling of international bonds listed on the world stock exchanges. And so a country such as Russia could issue bonds listed on the stock exchanges in London, New York, Paris, Berlin, Amsterdam, and the differences in the exchange rates between the countries were basically arbitraged by buying or selling of bonds in different markets. And so what really ended up happening is that as these European stock exchanges started to shut down, there became a big issue or concern that all of the selling would just go overseas, and those people that needed that liquidity would basically hammer the New York Stock Exchange, and so it was one massive coordinated shutdown, and so it really interesting that it happened, but it wasn't. What to me was the most interesting was that it happened and lasted so long. Like you would think that after 3-4 months, like after even a couple of weeks, they would have kind of structured everything together and got it open again. But the fact that it stayed closed for so long was the part that really captured my attention and made me want to kind of bring it up. But what was also interesting was the fact that there became a huge over-the-counter market for these stocks. So while the main exchange was closed, many of the shares kept trading over the counter, right?
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
So they just kept trading it. Oh,
OTC, yeah, right. Basically, they made their own.
I don't think it was actually. Is that what they call curbside trading? Like it wasn't actually over any counter. I think it was out on the street, right?
The notes here didn't specify that, so I could only offer speculation. But what was interesting to me was something like this would make me feel like this would have been a huge market crash, right? Like we were talking about 1893, and then we've talked about 1929 and 1907, and so I would have naturally thought that with a closure like this, that this would have seen a monstrous drop in the markets. But they recreated the price action that occurred during the market closures through the trading of these stocks in over the counter. And really, the Dow Jones dropped from about the 60 level down to about 49, right? Like it was just like a 20% drop over the month. So I would have like we saw a 20% drop in the markets October through December, right? Like so, I mean, this was not exactly a crazy market drop. Right.
I didn't realize that they had actually figured out how much it had dropped, kind of theoretically in the
Yeah.
It's actually
And by the way,
fascinating.
I all of the information I'm sharing, I want to give a shout out because this Brian Taylor from Global Financial Data put this article together. I'm just literally referencing everything from the article. So I just wanted to make sure that anyone who wanted to read the whole piece, you can just take a look at, just Google businessinsider.com and Brian Taylor, and you can read the whole article on this. But yeah, it was interesting. I just can't imagine a market closure for 4 months nowadays. I don't think traders would be able to, like, I think people would go insane.
Well, and the last time we had a market closure for any length of period was actually 9/11.
9/11, and that was for like 3-4 days, right?
I think wasn't it a little more than that? I can't remember exactly, but it was, and that was mostly just a function of the fact that the lines in New York City had been severed, and there was issues with that, and in terms of the settlement, as opposed to the
the difference there was that New York shut down, but this during World War I was like pretty much the entire global stock market complex was shut down.
Yeah, but
all European exchanges, Russia's
but
exchange.
most European countries were involved in the war. So
yeah, true.
So
but it certainly did influence the U.S. and that it's funny because today we talk about the internet and global interconnectedness, but it was global interconnectedness existed in 1914, right? Like, I mean, people were wiring; they had cables going across the ocean, and people were wiring orders from Europe to New York back and forth. There was that kind of capital movement even back then. It's pretty cool.
I wonder what the latency was on their orders.
I'm pretty sure there was nothing high frequency. I don't think
there was nothing measured in milliseconds. I can.
No, I don't think so. All right.
Okay, well, thanks for sharing that with us, Patrick.
Yeah.